the enduring Iceman from Top Gun, the fiery Jim Morrison from The Doors, and the sullen Batman from Batman Forever. Val Kilmer were more than just actors. For decades, he was a hurricane that swept through Hollywood. He had steel-sharp eyes, his voice had a symphonic resonance, and his talent was a holy fire that would never go out, turning each part into a memory that would live on in the hearts of millions of people. At one point, he was the height of popularity, brilliant, untouchable, and an apparently eternal star. At 65, however, the blaze has waned and died, leaving behind a melancholy stillness that is more weighted than countless cheers. The world is left with profound rifts in memory and unanswered questions regarding the unseen loads that crushed his last days, because of the suffocating darkness and hidden pain that lie within that quiet. Like the last storm he carried into the night. Who can comprehend such heartbreaking loneliness? If Val Kilmer is on your mind, show him your respect by praying that his light will endure in our spirits forever, or by lighting a single candle in the dark. Val Kilmer found himself transported back to the broken heart of his early years, in Los Angeles, as the echoes of the silver screen's applause faded behind him. There, the boy he was with was marked by the first scars of family strife, and the early shadows of loss, which encircled his young soul like an unrelenting storm, and shaped every heartbeat, thought, and delicate step toward the man he would become. He was born in 1959 into a family of 3 boys, including his younger brother Wesley, whose epilepsy tainted even the best times, and his older brother Mark. At first glance, Val's early environment appeared to sparkle with typical warmth. Eugene, a parent, is engrossed in real estate activities, a home full with play and laughter. A kind woman named Gladys, who woven calm love into every part of their lives. However, beneath this exterior, there were silent but persistent cracks that carved paths of loneliness and desire into the outlines of his inner life, molding a young man who would grow up to be a man who would always be surrounded by loss, absence, and the delicate pain of unsaid grief. The unimaginable happened when he was just 9 years old. 3 brothers were left in their father's custody after his parents' marriage fell apart. But in his friendship with Eugene, Val sensed a frigid chasm that would last for years. "I grew quiet, reflective, and reclusive," he would later admit, words laden with the burden of a youngster whose anguish is too much for his frail body, and who must make his way through the confusing labyrinth of adult strife. Less than 10 years later, a second completely catastrophic sorrow occurred, tearing through the delicate tapestry of his adolescence. And the breakup of family was just the beginning. Fate abruptly claimed Wesley, his brother, his best friend, and the young man he most respected. He was full of artistic aspirations and dreams of becoming a filmmaker. Wesley had a devastating seizure and fell into the family pool just before Val was leaving for Juilliard in New York, creating a void that reverberated throughout Val's entire being. Val experienced such intense anguish at the age of 17 that it almost overtook him. Years later, he acknowledged, "It took me 2, maybe 3 years just to feel grounded again." The depth of sorrow that had formed a chasm of emptiness inside him was revealed by a voice that trembled even in memory. He would carry a hollow, sometimes concealed by his bluster, and other times painfully apparent in the silence of his apartment. This early experience with mortality served as the benchmark for every round of applause and every victory on stage and film. Fear of frailty, lost love, and premature deaths overshadowed every decision and artistic endeavor. Even though he would later embody the cold precision of Iceman or the fiery magnetism of Jim Morris, the twin blows of a broken home and an early death created a gnawing, unrelenting loneliness. An ache so intimate, it was like an extension of his own breath, driving him toward the sanctuary of art, where characters and stories became vessels to contain his anguish, to transform suffering into brilliance. Beneath every action was the echoes of forgotten laughter, the recollection of a brother's smile, and the icy tension with his father. Each phrase shaped him, haunted him, and created a resilience that was both dazzling and delicate. Now, the youngster who had learnt to accept loneliness at such a young age, turned that suffering into art, and a voice that could change the world. Val Kilmer would be defined not only as an actor, but also as a man whose deepest pains became the hidden, potent fuel of his legend, burning subtly but extremely brightly. It was this alchemy of grief into art, of heartbreak into presence, a blaze that will never go out, birthed in the darkness. The sound of a little boy's laughter ought to have been unhindered, but for Val Kilmer, loss and absence always loomed over happiness. The world felt inhumanely brutal, even at the onset of puberty. a sight where the brutal power of love and sorrow collided, leaving holes in a heart too young to handle them. Val Kilmer discovered a haven in the theater, where sorrow could be dressed as a costume, anguish could be expressed through the rhythm of another life, and the shadows of his early losses could be turned into body and voice. He made his acting debut at the age of 12, Class, a shaky child who was grieving over the unexpected death of his brother, and found a brief reprieve from the constant pain of his own life, through the careful enactment of roles. Simple luxuries or typical childhood play could not quench the desire for truth in his eyes. He had been wounded too early by the merciless hand of fate, and his wounds would never completely heal. Nevertheless, he persisted, motivated by a nearly desperate want to be heard, to declare his existence and significance in a world that had taken so much from him before he even knew what loss meant. By the age of 16, Val Kilmer found himself on the brink of both grief and potential. What his heart had long known was finally acknowledged by the professional art world. He was admitted as the youngest student at Juilliard School, the sacred furnace that had produced such luminaries as Christopher Reeve and Robin Williams. However, the victory of acceptance was veiled in a veil of quiet sorrow, a sorrow that stuck to his breast like an unrelenting winter, saying that all happiness would always be tinged with absence. This dream was burdened with memory at every turn. Each breath was a delicate balancing act between hope and the nagging pain of what had been lost too soon. The young Val's unwavering attitude clashed brutally with a world that prioritized compromise and convenience, even as he entered the New York casting rooms. When he refused to say lines he couldn't believe, a hamburger ad audition ended abruptly. A 12-year-old youngster making a decision that would lose him a chance, but adamantly stating that honesty and truth were more important than temporary acceptance. Later, in a voice laden with memory, he reflected, "I would sooner leave the world's cheers than betray the character's essence." The soul of a youngster, and soon-to-be man, who had already experienced the harshness of fate, is included in those remarks. Who had discovered that the road of integrity is frequently a lonely, agonizing one, and filled with sacrifices that are hidden from everyone but the heart that carries them? A legend of uncompromising artistry could emerge from the furnace of grief and untimely loss, burning with a brilliance all the more luminous for the shadows from which it emerged. Nights spent practicing lines in near silence, sleeping little and eating less were not merely craft exercises, but acts of devotion, alchemy transforming early sorrow into presence, turning heartbreak into a fierce, piercing voice. Every little part, every muttered line, and every audience member's feeble cheers stitched together a delicate armor against the world's apathy and the eerie emptiness left by Wesley's absence. Nights spent in off-Broadway theaters under dim lights and bitter cold turned into a testing ground for self-control. He led a modest life, slept little, and focused solely on the alchemy of craft, transforming suffering into a presence that was unadulterated, sharp and distinctly his own. But the price was constant: separation from family, a young man harmed by tragedy, doors shut because he wouldn't give in, every sacrifice a mute reminder of the suffering that had brought him to the stage in the first place. The thought of what he had lost followed him at every step. "I must keep going. I must not let him be forgotten," he occasionally said to himself in those lonely nights, shaking with anguish. This revealed a young spirit struggling with heartbreak that could have broken even the strongest of hearts. The reality of Val Kilmer's early career shows through it all, not as charm or chance, but as a reflection of a spirit shaped by loss, disciplined by suffering, and fiercely faithful to the art that provided both solace and revelation, demonstrating that the path of genius is frequently shaped by an unrelenting dedication to truth in the face of heartbreak, loneliness, and the ruthless demands of a harsh reality, rather than by luck. A boy who had the courage to transform excruciating agony into a radiant, flaming presence that would one day enthrall generations. He will soon be hailed as a star by the entire world. Behind every grin and every honor, however, was a life where every victory pierced the heart like a blade, a soul beaten by unrelenting loneliness, and a heart damaged by sacrifice. It was a ruthless, vicious irony. The child who had turned to art for solace suddenly had to deal with a celebrity that delighted everyone but plagued him personally. From the chilly, alone evenings of off-Broadway theaters and the brittle triumphs of New York casting rooms, Val Kilmer's unwavering quest for artistic truth led him to a fate that would simultaneously make him a worldwide celebrity and leave him with permanent scars in his personal life. The 24-year-old youngster, who had once shuddered in a small acting class, had emerged into the harsh glare of Hollywood by the mid-1980s. When success shone like a double-edged sword that could cut with ruthless accuracy, but was also beautiful and blinding. Iceman, the unwavering fighter of Top Gun, was introduced to the world in 1986 at the age of 25, and Val became a symbol ingrained in the cultural mind with just one role. He never could have predicted the immortalization of his visage and demeanor. Nevertheless, the irony was intolerable. He had joined the project grudgingly, considering the script to be superficial, a contract obligation that would bind him to a level of renown he neither wanted nor desired. Additionally, the conflict that would characterize his life in the ensuing decades was hinted at by this grudging acceptance of stardom. This friction would cause his marriage to Joanne Wall-E to suffer, his young children to feel as though they were missing a father, and he would become known throughout Hollywood as bright but impossible to work with, an intense man who inspired as much as he intimidated. Years later, Val acknowledged in his memoir, "I sacrifice everything to become them, but I still lose parts of who I am." A chilling admission that exposed the unseen scars, concealed beneath every acclaimed performance, and the personal cost of a genius reluctant to make concessions. The 33-year-old Val sought the burning depth of human truth as the 1990s dawned, rather than the transient sparkle of fame. And he gave himself up to Jim Morrison in The Doors in 1991 with an almost obsessive love, almost living the icon's life, including imitating his speech, performing his songs, and using his own demeanor as both confession and armor. He received a lot of applause for the performance, but it also made him seem harsh and severe. He was followed from studio lot to studio lot by whispers of caution. At home, his all-consuming approach caused the marriage that had previously provided intimacy to permanently break apart. Later, Oliver Stone would acknowledge that Val spoke from the bottom of his heart, not knowing how his remarks affected other people, a reflection of the sacrifices eating away at his family life, and a testament to the consuming fire of his approach, leaving his spouse and kids in the shadows of a brilliance that demanded everything. At 35, Val Kilmer found a rare communion of craft and recognition in Tombstone, 1993, embodying Doc Holliday with such layered brilliance that peers and critics alike were left in awe. Articles from the time, such as one published in Entertainment Weekly in 1996, reaffirmed this perception, highlighting how his extraordinary intensity alienated colleagues, even as it elevated him to artistic heights. Even the coveted role of Batman in 1995's Batman Forever, a dream to many, turned into a furnace of frustration. Encased in rubber and constrained by commercial spectacle, he found himself a puppet of costume and expectation, a tension he loathed. However, the joy of mastery was tempered by the constant glare of media scrutiny, with articles highlighting his difficult reputation, and the private ache of personal compromise ever present, a victory tinged with resentment and the hollow echo of personal loss. But in the midst of the victories and hardships in 1995, with titans like Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, Val at last caught a glimpse of the respect of peers. It was a brief moment of comfort that validated the artist beneath the star, a man whose unwavering commitment to authenticity had both defined and wounded him. "I give everything to become them, and yet I lose pieces of myself," revealing a soul whose extraordinary gifts were carved directly from the furnace of personal cost, where genius and grief became inseparable companions, creating a legend whose brilliance shone as brightly as the private sorrows that shaped him. Each role, each accolade, carried the weight of choices made and sacrifices endured. It was an unrelenting testament to a life lived at the intersection of brilliance and torment. Val Kilmer's heart bore scars that fame could never heal, and in the middle of that tumultuous awakening in the mid-1980s, when his star started its quick rise through Top Secret and the legendary Top Gun, he met Cher, a woman 13 years his senior, who was already a superstar, whose presence blazed with the intensity of someone who had lived, loved, and survived. Cher was a magnet, a storm of power and warmth, a presence that calmed and tormented Kilmer, who still felt the hollow echoes of a childhood filled with longing and absence. Their connection was electric but brittle, a collision of experience and vulnerability, where Cher became both a lover and a haven, a mirror reflecting his deepest fears and unspoken desires. Cher never leaves your heart once she has won it. He would later remember a confession that was weighed down by both devotion and heartbreak, because this was not a passing fad but rather a meeting of souls that revealed every tender crack he had been keeping hidden for years. The nights spent together were euphoric, but they were also tinged with an unspoken sadness. Kilmer recalled leaving hotel lobbies with cameras flashing, feeling the cruel irony that he could command the world's attention, but fail to hold the woman who had entered the deepest chambers of his heart. Kilmer's rising fame required him to take long absences, and the shadow of his past loneliness lingered, whispering that happiness, no matter how radiant, was always provisional. In times of quiet contemplation, Val would trace the contours of memory, the laughter and the ache interwoven, and realize that the intensity of his emotions mirrored the intensity of the life he pursued on screen. Their love, though passionate, turned into a furnace of loss and longing, each embrace a temporary haven, and each separation a reminder of the sacrifices required by the life he had chosen. The union with Cher, though brief in public view, was a vivid testament to a man struggling with the intersection of desire and duty, of longing and isolation, of a love that illuminated his soul while simultaneously exposing the hollows carved by ambition, fame, and the relentless pursuit of authenticity. Every role, every victory, demanded surrender, leaving pieces of his heart behind in the spaces he could never reclaim. This chapter, bright yet painfully human, etched itself into his memory as both a lesson and a wound, a reminder that the pursuit of connection is inextricably linked to the sacrifices required by genius, and that the very brilliance that attracted the attention of the world frequently casts the longest shadows upon the soul. As Kilmer progressed through subsequent relationships, the echo of that first profound attachment persisted, influencing his decisions, haunting his solitude, and reminding him that even the brightest love could not protect a fragile heart from life's storms. Val Kilmer entered a new chapter that promised the glittering light of stability, love, and a Hollywood fairy tale as the raging fires of early passion, with Cher gradually faded, leaving behind smoldering embers of longing and unhealed hurts. A chapter that was intertwined with Joanne Wall-E, whose presence seemed to be both a haven and a mirror, reflecting the turmoil, the longing, and the tender fractures that lingered in his soul. When the 28-year-old Val met Joanne on the Willow, set in 1988, he found in her not just a partner but a sanctuary, a kindred spirit who could bear the weight of his restless heart, and the turbulence of a young star caught between isolation and ambition. They were married by the end of that year, and while the media praised their union as a fairy tale romance, shining and admirable, beneath the glittering exterior were the shadows that fame would cast with unrelenting cruelty. Mercedes and Jack, a little ray of hope and light, arrived in 1991 and 1995 respectively, and their laughter reverberated through hallways that were all too frequently empty, due to a father who was physically there but emotionally consumed by the unrelenting gravity of his profession. For months, the character of Jim Morrison in The Doors had required Val to live as someone else, a complete absorption that muddled the boundaries of his own identity, leaving Joanne to pace quiet hotel rooms and studio sets, clinging to the shattered pieces of a family maintained by oblique gestures, hushed words, and stolen moments. Every day a fine balancing act between absence and love. At the height of his artistic success, Val was able to command the attention of the world while failing to fulfill the most basic and sacred duty of keeping his family intact. Rumors of infidelity swirled, with tabloids implying that Cindy Crawford was involved, each rumor carved deeper into the delicate flesh of guilt, longing, and despair. In 1996, the delivery of divorce papers on the set of The Island of Dr. Moreau was a moment of shattering symbolism, where art and life collided violently, scattering pieces of his heart across scripts, studio lots, and the quiet rooms he had once dreamed to fill with warmth. Every step on set, every scene, and every lonely night served as a reminder of the price exacted by genius. The contours of memory, Mercedes's first laugh, Jack's tiny hand reaching for him, Joanne's fleeting smiles, and the crushing paradox of a man whose brilliance illuminated the world, but left darkness in the hearts of those he loved. Most were all traced by Val in the long nights that followed. The unrelenting reality that the search of authenticity in art exacts a toll that may shatter the very foundations of intimacy and love was made clear by the way that every embrace lost, every whispered phrase unsaid, and every longing glance became a reflection of the sacrifices required by the life he had chosen. Val realized the harsh symmetry of life as he thought back on those years. The higher his star rose, the darker the shadows fell on his house, the more he was dedicated to his roles, the more his children's laughter faded into a far-off echo, a melancholy tune that would not go away. A man who was both gifted and deeply wounded, whose quest for artistic truth cost him the very family that could have saved him. is the subject of this chapter, which is brilliant but heartbreakingly human. It left behind a legacy of passion, regret, and the irrevocable reminder that even the most brilliant Hollywood fairy tale can harbor the deepest, most unrelenting shadows, and that in the unrelenting pursuit of genius, the soul may be exalted beyond measure, yet irrevocably broken. Rumors of alleged encounters with Cindy Crawford started to circulate in tabloids by the mid-1990s, as the fragile strands of Val Kilmer's marriage to Joanne Wall-E shook under the constant pressures of Hollywood. Some even suggested that these rumored encounters may have played a role in the breakdown of his marriage. Alone in hotel suites and empty hallways, the weight of unspoken accusations pressed against his chest, blending with memories of Mercedes's bright, fleeting laughter, Jack's tiny hands stretching for him across beds he'd left cold, and Joanne's gaze, once a sanctuary, now shadowed by absence and uncertainty. Val never confirmed any of it, never gave them life with words, but the shadows of suggestion gnawed at him in the quietest hours. The world saw a star, bright and untouchable, but inside him a tempest raged, guilt, longing, and the hollow ache of loneliness where love and suspicion collided. Every rumor, even if unproven, twisted inside him, magnifying every lost embrace, every tender moment he had failed to hold, and every laugh that faded before it could be fully captured. The rumor hung like a shadow over the frail remains of family, and in the dead hours he traced Joanne's brief smiles in memory, felt the ghost of her hand against his, and shuddered at the unfathomable cruelty of absence, knowing that even ephemeral, unconfirmed whispers could cut as deeply as truth. He had loved and lost in ways that left his chest hollow but trembling. But when Daryl Hannah appeared on a movie set in the early 2000s, it was as if a spark ignited inside him, fragile and fierce, a light trembling in the shadowed canyon of his heart. He was a haunting reminder that fame can illuminate the world while leaving the heart raw, broken and trembling under the relentless weight of longing and regret. Their evenings were filled with golden sunlight that faded into violet dusk, laughter that spilled like fragile music, whispers that brushed the soul, and hands that met and lingered just a heartbeat too long. They were on the quiet, windswept expanse of his New Mexico ranch, far from the glare of cameras and the shallow adoration of strangers. Val would later refer to it as the most painful love of my life. Every moment spent with her was both soothing and agonizing, a haven from the ghosts of love's past that smoldered like unextinguished embers in the corners of his memory. Every laugh was a frail heartbeat against the unrelenting echo of loneliness. He recalled the gentle tremor of her hand in his, the curve of her smile, the silent calm of evenings when the wind whispered through pines, and the world beyond the ranch vanished. And even penning the words sent a tremble through his chest, a pulse of need that would not go away. Even as illness tore at his body, the wound in his chest throbbed with unrelenting insistence, a pulse of love unspent, a hollow ache entwined with the solitude that followed him like a shadow he could never outrun. Daryl's breath caught, his heart hammered, his eyes stinging with tears that would not fall. The finality hit him like a physical blow when he married Neil Young in 2018. "I have not had a long-term girlfriend for 20 years, he admitted, his voice barely above the night's silence, a stark echo of a man whose brilliance had once enthralled millions, now living in haunting quiet. The string of previous romances, Sure, Joanne, and the whispered rumors of Cindy and Daryl, left him unspoiled by lasting companionship. A whisper of footsteps never met, laughter never shared, hands never held, shadows of love lost, echoes of silenced laughter, and unhealed scars of heartache carved the silhouette of a man luminous yet painfully alone, whose life had been dedicated to authenticity and artistry, but whose soul bore the cruel truth. Night after night, the darkness closed in, the silence broken only by the irregular rhythm of his own heartbeat. Each breath he took, each chill down his spine, each pounding pulse in his chest, reminded him that the price of uncompromising genius was often the deepest, most intimate love, forever lost, leaving the heart trembling, aching, and hauntingly unfulfilled. Brilliance could light up the world, but intimacy, love, and the warmth of shared life could slip through his fingers, postponed, untouchable. Val Kilmer's genius had always been both a fiery salvation and a cruel curse, a fire that illuminated every soul he touched on screen, but scorched the delicate connections around him with equal intensity. A single beacon flickering against the unrelenting darkness of a life that was both extraordinary and unbearably lonely. On the set of The Island of Dr. Backstage, rumors of clashes with director Richard Stanley, who was fired before filming started, portrayed him as erratic, unyielding, and relentless, a man whose quest for truth and performance unsettled the very ground beneath him. In 1996, the tension with John Frankenheimer was more than just a disagreement. It was a violent collision of artistry against expectation. Frankenheimer, furious beyond measure, declared he would never work with Kilmer again, dutifully documented him among celebrities who create enemies on set, and publicly branded him as a challenging actor. But only Val was aware of the internal conflict. He later admitted in Val 2021 that he had acted badly, bravely, and with a razor-edged self-reflection, juggling pride, guilt, and the unachievable demands of art. Each inhale tight, each exhale tremulous, a drum of perfection pursued without compromise. He recalled nights spent alone in his apartment, the faint hum of distant traffic vibrating through the floor, the city lights bleeding through the blinds like shards of memory, and the echo of his own heartbeat loud in the hollow space of expectation. Method acting consumed him completely. In his quest for authenticity, he sacrificed ease, patience, and even friendship in order to fully inhabit his characters' minds, feeling every nuance, tremor, and flaw as if his very soul depended on it. And yet that devotion, radiant, exacting, and unyielding, isolated him, shut down projects that could have defined generations, labeled him as difficult to work with in Hollywood, and made him an outsider in the very world he had illuminated. Admired, feared, but ultimately alone. Every heartbeat was a drum of brilliance and punishment entwined. In the silence of his apartment, he traced invisible lines of memory, shadows of laughter, lost scripts abandoned, colleagues' faces flickering like distant stars, and felt the cruel symmetry. Nights stretched endlessly, applause turning into hollow echoes, loneliness pressing against him like a tangible weight. Haunted, aching, and achingly human, his legacy shone on screens, immortal, but at a cost: isolation, misjudgment, and estrangement etched deep into his chest, a never-ending throb of longing, a reminder that the highest devotion to artistry can demand solitude so profound that even a heart ablaze with genius can beat forever in shadow. Acquired years earlier, the expansive expanse of over 6,000 acres in San Miguel County near Santa Fe had been a haven, a personal temple where the air itself seemed to cradle memory and creativity. By the mid-2000s, Val Kilmer's New Mexico ranch stood not just as a property but as a sanctuary carved from the turmoil of a life lived in the harsh lights of Hollywood. Here, Val wrote, thought, and immersed himself in projects like Salt Sky, and the walls were covered with pictures, home videos, and remnants of family moments, a silent record of presence and laughter that stood in stark contrast to the isolation that came with being famous. However, the stresses of financial reality, exacerbated by IRS tax debts, reported in 2006, started to erode this haven. The land that had been a source of comfort, a canvas for artistic and emotional healing, was now a painful reminder of loss when Val was forced to sell more than 5,000 acres for about $18.5 million in 2011, reducing his once expansive sanctuary to a mere 160 acres, a piece of the personal world he had painstakingly created. Kilmer later reflected on the ranch with a deep sense of mourning, and in his mind's eye lingered a photograph of himself and his father on the property, a frozen testament to love, guidance, and belonging, now overshadowed by the necessity of commerce. Even endeavors like opening the ranch as a bed and breakfast, intended to share the beauty and serenity with guests, became entangled in disputes with local residents over land use and traffic, turning his refuge into a source of tension and strain rather than peace. Every tree cut down, every acre given up felt like a hole in the heart, every dollar earned for survival, a bitter restitution for the closeness and security that were irrevocably lost. And the silent breathing of nights spent in creative immersion seemed to tremble under the weight of transactions and commitments, leaving him exposed, bereft, and deeply human. In the isolation of the remaining 160 acres, Val faced the harsh paradox. The ranch, which had once been a symbol of recovery, had now turned into a symbol of sacrifice, a quiet observer of the loss of safety, imagination, and mental sanctuary, health, fame, family, and now, the very land that had served as his soul's compass, all crystallized here in the amber light of sunset over the New Mexico hills, reminding him that even genius and artistry cannot evade the unrelenting toll of life's uncompromising pressures, and that sometimes the deepest wounds are inscribed not on the body or in the public eye, but in the sacred spaces of the heart, where no praise or recognition can reach. Val Kilmer's body, which had once been a source of unrelenting energy and a commanding presence, started to betray him in ways that no Hollywood script could have predicted by 2014. The diagnosis was harsh: throat cancer, a silent killer that infiltrated his voice, the very thing that had made characters memorable and moved millions of people. His gift, the lilt, the tone, the cadence that had enthralled Iceman, Jim Morrison, and innumerable other souls, was suddenly under siege, fragile, slipping like sand through his fingers. Surgery ensued, followed by 2 tracheotomies that carved not only his throat but a path through fear and loneliness. He had always been a man who used his voice as a tool of creation, a conduit of emotion. For months, words were imprisoned. Radiation, chemotherapy, the cold, sterile regimen of medicine that clashed with his Christian Science upbringing, and the feeding tube, a grim reminder of mortality pressing on the edges of daily life, forced him into a landscape he had once observed from a distance, now intimately, painfully, and brutally. Every lost syllable was a reminder of identity vanishing, a vocation under siege, a soul asking if it could continue without its defining instrument. And conversations turned into doodles and notebooks, movies and gestures. Nights were the worst. Imagine the warmth of family dinners, the sound of scripts read aloud on a set now only in memory, the laughter of children, and the hollow of his throat like a void where dreams once spoke. He was alone in the dark, the lights muted through blinds, and he could hear the echo of his own heartbeat more clearly than any applause. Each procedure, each painful swallow, each raspy attempt at speech became a struggle, not only for life but also for meaning, dignity, and the tenuous continuity of a career that had defined him. His children, like steady anchors in the storm, pleaded with him to submit to modern medicine, to trust science against instinct and doctrine. And he did, torn between faith, pride, and love, realizing that survival required compromise he had never been taught. He found artistry and adaptation in this abyss, where his voice faltered, he wrote. Where it could not sing, he gestured. The world watched in glimpses. His once abundant but now dispersed fans left him in a silence heavier than any audience's applause, a quiet exile in the life he had built so publicly. Every morning he would trace letters with shaking hands, try a phrase on camera, remember the thrill of a line delivered flawlessly, and let grief swell for the performer who existed in shadow, who could hear his own talent disappear in steps too cruel to measure. Where the stage was inaccessible, he filmed, documented, turned suffering into testimony, into Val itself, a portrait of resilience so intimate it was nearly intolerable to witness. By 2017, when the world finally realized the full extent of his condition, Val did not seek sympathy. Despite the fog of pain, uncertainty, and the weight of mortality pressing like invisible chains, he managed to hold a thread to life across his ribs, through family, faith, and art. He learned that being heard could take forms beyond sound, that expression could survive when the body rebelled, and that love could coax courage from fear. He sought connection, testimony, and memory. He was both diminished and unbroken, a man who had lost the voice that had made him who he was, but not the soul that had kept him going. He demonstrated in the silent suffering of illness that creativity, even when muted, can endure, and that brilliance, even when scarred, can endure. At the age of 61, Val Kilmer returned to the cinematic sky, not just as Iceman but as a man facing time itself, a lifetime of memory, loss, and the silent deterioration of his own voice. That Val Kilmer's essence, the heart, the mind, the fire within, was alive, defiant, and profoundly human, leaving the audience with a witness not just to a voice but also to courage, fragility, and the unwavering persistence of spirit against the ravages of flesh and time. In reality, the instrument that once defined his artistry, his own voice, had been stolen by illness, leaving him to inhabit the space between presence and absence, between what was spoken and what could only be felt. For more than 35 years, the world had remembered him as the unflinching, sharp-eyed fighter pilot who stood alongside Maverick. Now, in Top Gun, Maverick has returned. RPE breathed life into a voice, taken from decades of recordings, a voice that belonged to the man he once was, not entirely to the man he had become. Kilmer's mind wandered as the cameras rolled, recalling the first time he donned the uniform. A brief, miraculous cameo allowed him to speak again, but through the meticulous reconstruction of AI technology. And now, facing the screen again, he saw in Cruise's eyes the echo of decades of friendship, challenge, and shared history. The thrill of flight, the rivalry with Tom Cruise's Maverick, the laughter, the tension, the bond that had subtly endured beyond the scripts, beyond the applause, and the bitter ache of a voice lost, of a talent imprisoned in a body betrayed by time. However, he was able to connect with the audience, connect with his own history, and speak the words that had once flown from his lips with ease, thanks to this technological bridge. In that brief conversation with Maverick, every look, hand-to-shoulder contact, and slight head tilt turned into a tribute to the years that had passed, to the grief and laughter that had molded him, to the man who had been Iceman and was now more. Tom Cruise, who was affected beyond words, had insisted on this return because he understood the incomparable weight of history, friendship, and cinematic legend. It is a living memory, a tribute to endurance, and a reminder of what it means to persevere when the body fails but the spirit persists. Joseph Kosinski acknowledged that it was the most emotionally charged scene he had ever shot. When Kilmer's voice was reconstructed, it wasn't just Iceman speaking to Maverick. Rather, it was Val Kilmer greeting the world he had captivated, whispering to all of the viewers, "I am still here, through the veil of illness." The fusion of art and technology, memory and presence, past and present, all came together to create the delicate, eerie reminder that even when life takes away what we hold dear, creativity, love, and remembrance can restore it. In that moment, joy entwined with sorrow, triumph entwined with loss, and audiences felt as though they were there, witnessing a miracle. This allowed a man, a friend, a legend to speak once more, to reclaim a piece of the self that had seemed lost forever. Val Kilmer lived in a paradox of creation and silence in his last years. He retreated into the peaceful nooks of his New Mexico ranch, where the desert wind brought him comfort and solitude. But he also occasionally traveled to Los Angeles to receive medical treatments that tore away at his body, but never his soul. Mercedes and Jack were close by, encircling him like a delicate circle of light in the midst of accumulating shadows. Their presence was the one balm against the weight of an existence that had taken his voice, his greatest instrument, but was unable to take the words pouring from his pen or the colors from his brushes as he filled journals, painted canvases, and re-edited the hundreds of hours of footage he had once obsessively captured. This was a gentler version of him than the world's common perception of him, as a man dying in solitude. In the stillness of his small remaining 160 acres, once a sprawling 6,000-acre dream, he found a kind of refuge, a space stripped bare of grandeur, where every wall whispered of what was lost, and every corner reminded him that material wealth, estimated at between $10 million and $25 million, was fleeting, but the real fortune was memory itself. He entrusted his children with the footage so they could tell the story he feared he could not finish. He signed away almost 5,000 acres in 2011, at the age of 61, and he subsequently admitted to a friend that he felt he had sold not only land, but chunks of his own youth buried in its soil. He had pressed into photographs, scripts, and tapes that no one else had seen. This pain never healed. But every year that went by, the body betrayed him more and more. The tracheostomy left him speechless. The radiation and feeding tubes thinned his body, until the mirror showed a man who was frail and gnarled by time, staring back at his own mortality. And in his journal at age 63, he scrolled with trembling letters, "I used to be all thunder and all voice, but now paper must speak for me," the ink smudging as though the page itself cried. Nevertheless, he got up every day to write, paint, and watch old movies, some of his own, some of others possibly reliving the paths not taken, the roles that never were, and muttering in the quiet about regrets, not spending more time with his kids. Untold stories and unfulfilled love. His final bequest was unseen, notwithstanding the tabloid speculations about his financial situation. It was a legacy of tenacity, of voice fragments preserved in a one-man piece like Cinema Twain, of a cameo in Top Gun, and not of ranches sold or estates inventoried. In that silence, Maverick made one final eerie gesture. He stood before the world one last time, not as a broken man but as a man who defied eraser. However, beneath that victory was the pain of knowing that his voice had been taken from him, leaving him to communicate only in whispers and scrawls. 5 weeks prior to his death, he made an appearance on Instagram in a brief wordless video, wearing the Batman mask he had previously worn on screen. It was a brief moment that was recorded not as a spectacle, but rather as a farewell, as though he were saying goodbye through the only man the world will ever remember. His memoir, I'm Your Huckleberry, served as his last confession. in which he acknowledged the pain of absence, the ghosts of unfinished work, and the unrelenting loneliness of nights spent in silence. The image of that masked figure, frail but uncompromising, spread across headlines from People to the Sun, leaving fans all over the world shaken by the realization that this was his final blow before the curtain fell. And as pneumonia drew its final curtain, his last breath slipped away, not into emptiness, but into the embrace of those who loved him most. And on the night of April 2025 at 65, the room was quiet, each breath cracking like old film unspooling, until he reached for Jack's hand and pressed once as if to pour a lifetime of unsaid words into that fragile grip. The man who had embodied gods, heroes, and devils was left with the tenderness of a father, an artist, and a human being whose final gift was to remind us that even when the voice is gone, the echoes remain, carried forward by those who loved him, by those who will keep telling his story until silence itself is filled with memory. His chest rose one last time before falling still against the circle of family who held him. The end did not come in abandonment, but in the warmth of his children's hands, and the vigil of family who refused to let him slip away unseen. Then came the most painful fact of all. When the room fell into complete quiet, the world recognized that his death had not only left an empty chair at a family circle, but had also shattered the hush in Hollywood's memory, where even silence now wears his shadow. Not only is Val Kilmer no longer with us, but we are also grieved by his decision to depart from this world in a manner so profound that it is nearly intolerable. After decades of living under the glaring spotlights and thunder of applause, he slipped away without any fanfare, curtain calls, or even a whisper to alert us to the storm he had been carrying inside. In those last months, there were no public farewells, no red carpets, no tributes. Only the raw solitude of long nights, the slow torment of a body turning against him, and the quiet pride of a soul that refused to beg for pity. No one could have predicted that the man who had once been so radiant, mischievous, and unyielding would withdraw into an absolute quiet, erecting invisible walls around his suffering, as if to protect himself and us from the intolerable. There is something unimaginably tragic about knowing that a man who gave so much to the world carried his heaviest burdens without anyone witnessing them. Was it pride that silenced him, or the intense desire to maintain his dignity in a world that thrives on collapse? Or something deeper? Was it the exhaustion of a spirit that had given everything? Or was it the innate belief that true strength lies in facing the dark alone? For those who loved him and marveled at him, the grief is not only for what has been lost but also for what was never revealed, never spoken, and never shared. However, there is also something painfully heroic about that last performance, which was not staged on camera or delivered with dialogue, but rather carved into silence, stillness, and a pain endured without an audience. Perhaps that is the legacy we rarely dare to name, not just the legacy of an actor but the legacy of a man. And as the world reopens interviews, replays his films, and revisits the words he left behind, one unwavering truth reverberates louder than applause. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought in complete silence. Farewell, Iceman. Goodbye, Batman. Goodbye to Doc Holliday. Goodbye to Jim Morrison. Goodbye to every unforgettable soul he brought to life with a rawness that seared itself into memory. He did more than just play parts. He left behind reverberations that time itself cannot erase. He was a man whose loudest farewell was the one he never spoke. In honor of Val Kilmer, the artist behind the mask, the man who gave the world legends, even after his own voice was taken away. A soul who endured more pain than any of us ever knew, but chose to face the world with pride, artistry, and a gentleness that never dimmed. The last frame now fades into black, leaving behind a silence that is more powerful than any scene, monologue, or applause. Leave your remembrance, your homage, your final farewell below, like this video, so that others too may experience the hidden light of a man who said farewell without ever needing to speak. If his performances once made you laugh, cry, or believe, or if his quiet now moves you more deeply than words, music.